The night in Dubai slowly descended on the huge airfield, dissolving into a warm haze over the concrete strips. The lights of the taxiways stretched along the horizon like thin threads, leading into the darkness of the Persian Gulf. And somewhere between them, he was standing. A giant Boeing 747-400, a cargo colossus that was about to take to the sky. The machine, designed to carry tons of cargo for thousands of kilometers, seemed especially calm today. Inside there is a steady hum of systems, rhythmic clicks of checks, and the usual routine before a night flight. Two pilots were talking quietly in the cockpit. Doug Lamp, the captain, is a man with the confidence that comes only after decades in the sky. And Matthew Bell is the co-pilot, a younger one, but already experienced enough to feel at home at the helm of such a giant. Their working day started like hundreds before. Unhurried inspections, planned refueling, containers fixed in the cargo hold, a familiar, well-planned ritual. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Neither is the sky, clear, dry, without clouds. No wind, just a light, almost gentle breeze. Not the plane itself, 3 years old, well-groomed, tested, ready to cross half the world in the dark. It was one of those evenings when everything works the way it should, when you can afford to exhale a little deeper before a long flight, when you can't even believe that in a few hours this calm world will collapse in flames, smoke, and desperate attempts to return to Earth. But for now, it's just night. It's just a job. Just two pilots getting ready for a routine flight to Cologne. The light of the devices reflects softly on their masks and documents. The radio crackles. Outside, machinery is securing the last cargo positions. Among dozens of pallets is one that no one knows yet, that it will change the course of this night. And when everything is ready, when the cargo doors close and the engines vibrate to life, nothing in their actions will betray that this shift will be the last. When the mechanics finally left the apron and the cargo doors slowly tightened with a steel shutter, the plane seemed to become heavier, not only physically, which is natural for hundreds of tons of cargo, but also the feeling of the journey ahead. The Boeing 747-400 has always created a strange feeling, as if a giant metallic organism is preparing to awaken. When the main systems in the cockpit turned on, gradually building a symphony of sounds, it seemed that the plane was pulling air into its lungs, preparing for an hour-long jerk. Doug Lamp glanced carefully at the dashboards. He did it confidently, without fuss, as does a person who not only knows every element in front of him, but understands that everything should be especially accurate today. The cargo is more than 100 tons. The route lasts 7 hours with almost no deviations. The silence of the night is deceptive and beautiful, but it requires attention. Over the years, Matthew Bell has managed to get used to the way the captain works. His speech is calm, his movements are precise, and every point on the control map is performed with such confidence that the illusion of ease of the process appears. Although everyone who has ever sat in a cargo liner with hundreds of tons under the wings knows that lightness is always conditional here. Behind the glass of the cockpit, Dubai looked like a giant glowing slab, a golden rectangle in a black desert. The night carters, who already knew the local routes almost by heart, moved between the parking lots. Other cargo ships were preparing to take off in the neighborhood. Some were loading fruits, some electronics, and some medical supplies. In this endless stream, no one thought that at this very moment, pallets, with tens of thousands of lithium batteries, were fixed under the belly of UPS Flight 6. Just one line in the invoice. There is only one pallet among dozens, and no one then suspected how quickly and destructively a chain reaction could develop inside such a cargo. But for now, these are just numbers in the documentation. Just a load that needs to be transported. At 1950 local time, the plane began to be pushed out of the parking lot. A low rumble filled the cabin as the tow truck began to work. Lamp and Bell unfolded maps and diagrams, checking the exit route to the taxiways. An eye-pleasing green line appeared on the displays, showing the way to runway 30R. Everything is according to the schedule. It's like 1,000 times before. When the tow truck disconnected and the cartwheels fell silent under it, the plane seemed to wake up completely. Lamp started the engines, one by one, from left to right, following the procedural sequences. The vibrations came from the center section, gently ran across the floor of the cabin, over the seats. The evening air outside the glass was trembling with hot jets. The systems have entered nominal modes. Temperatures are normal. The fuel has been checked. The exchange with the dispatcher is clean, short, and businesslike. Lamp confirmed the taxiing permit and smoothly brought the plane onto the main runway, leading to the end of the runway. There was silence over the 30R strip, as if the entire desert had held its breath. There was no fog, no sand, no wind. The perfect night for takeoff. Matthew placed the route map in the holder, adjusted the autopilot modes, and selected the necessary frequencies. He knew that takeoff would be his task. The flight to Europe was supposed to start under his control. It was their unspoken tradition. One pilot climbs manually, the other watches and controls without interference. Ready? Lamp looked at him through the microphone mask. Ready? Bell replied. The seconds stretched out the same way before takeoff. A short tension, a crumpling of the air, a slight anticipation. Even for such experienced pilots, this moment remained something personal. It feels like you're standing on the edge of a long corridor, and beyond that corridor is 7 o'clock in the night sky. As they taxied to the executive start, the strip lights lined up in front of them in a perfect white line. Lamp handed over the controls. Yours. Bell grabbed the steering wheel, brought the plane to the center line, and after receiving a short UPS 6 cleared for takeoff from the dispatcher, he calmly, almost casually applied the mode. 4 engines gave out power at once. The body of the plane was filled with vibration and then jerked forward. The mass of hundreds of tons increased the speed. 40 knots. 80. 120. The cabin shook slightly from the oncoming traffic. Bell gently held the strip, feeling the nose cone pass through a dense layer of warm air. V1 is the point of no return. Then, VR, the speed of ascent. Bell pulled the wheel back. And on this warm, absolutely normal, calm night, the cargo giant smoothly separated from the runway and began to climb. The dark desert below them alternately dissolved into the night and flashed with a scattering of lights. Everything was the same as always, like 100 times before. But, as is often the case in aviation, the first signals of impending disaster come quietly, very quiet. They didn't know yet that 10 minutes after this calm takeoff, their lives would turn into a struggle against something that even modern extinguishing systems are not always able to stop. The first minutes after takeoff always brought a sense of calm. The altitude rose steadily. as if the plane was gliding up invisible steps. The engines pulled steadily. The course was stable. Matthew held the plane by hand, enjoying the little time when the cold silence of the autopilot had not yet entered into operation. Pilots appreciate such moments especially much. A few minutes of real flight, when you can feel the car with every cell of the palm of your hand, with every vibration in the seat. At 20 mi, the cabin was flooded with soft instrument lights, and outside the windows, darkness had already completely engulfed Dubai. Ahead, there is only a flat horizon and a rapid, almost imperceptible movement towards Europe. But exactly 1 minute after they passed the 11,500 FT mark, a notification flashed on the central screen of the ECAS. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a line of text that any pilot has seen dozens of times in his life. Pack 1 fault. Bell pressed the autopilot button. It was time to instruct the onboard system to maintain altitude and direction. Lamp carefully opened the action card, slid his finger over the error reset routine. They both already knew that the malfunction had been noticed a few hours earlier when the plane arrived from Hong Kong. At that time, this did not cause any alarm. Pack 1 continued to work, albeit with a fault note in the system. Lamp restarted it according to the regulations, and the message disappeared as calmly as it appeared. Part of the teamwork of the pilots was precisely not to strain the psyche where the situation did not require extra nerves. Pack 1 is one of 3 air conditioning and boost systems. Everything is working well. 2 work well too. There are no passengers, no height restrictions. Everything seemed completely routine. The plane continued to climb. The autopilot was pulling the trajectory line exactly according to plan. The cabin returned to its usual background rhythm: the rustle of air, the slight crackle of communications, the quiet hum of fans. But at that moment, somewhere on the edge of hearing, something was already happening under the lower deck that the pilots would not be able to see or feel for a long time. On one of the pallets loaded with lithium batteries, a slow, almost invisible process of thermal acceleration began inside one of the cells. This is not an explosion or a flash, but a gradual increase in the internal temperature of the cell until the battery design loses stability. And when this happens, the contents begin to release heat much faster than they can give out, and the process becomes self-sustaining. But the crew didn't know that. Not a single indicator sounded an alarm. Not a single sensor has detected smoke yet. The harmony in the cabin remained complete. At 2010, the plane was already heading towards Bahrain. The dispatcher there took over control from Dubai and gave a new radio frequency. The pilots answered briefly, confidently, without signs of even the slightest nervousness. Everything was on schedule. It is precisely these calm stretches of long night flights that create a sense of complete stability for the crew. The feeling of proper flight. It feels like this whole giant structure of steel, cables, electronic systems, and fuel is completely under control. But after 3 minutes, everything will change. First, one sound, one bell, one of those signals that every pilot is afraid to hear. But for now, silence. Calm voices are heard in the cabin. Discussion of the route. Plans for the time of arrival in Cologne. It's the same as 1,000 times. And below them is the cargo deck. The one for which the Boeing 747-400 does not have an automatic extinguishing system. There, a few meters underfoot, in a metal container, among tens of thousands of small cylinders, one cell has already begun to heat up so much that nearby batteries also begin to absorb heat. It's not a fire yet. But this is no longer a normal situation. And in a moment, at 2013, the silence will end. The fire alarm on the main cargo deck is one of the most alarming, harsh, and categorical. Nothing in aviation gives a pilot such an adrenaline rush as the words "main deck fire," followed by a shrill bell. After a second, the ECAS will flash red lines. And at that moment, routine night work will turn into a struggle. For a minute, for height, for life. The bell rang so sharply that it seemed to tear apart the cabin space. Not the hum of an alarm, not a mild warning, but a sharp, piercing sound that appears in aviation only when every second begins to have weight. Lamp and Bell simultaneously looked up at the central screen of the ECAS, and there, among the lines, instantly flashed what every pilot fears the most. Fire. Main deck. WD. Fire on the main cargo deck, in the forward section. In cargo planes, such warnings are not hypothetical alarms. There are dozens of cases in the history of aviation where the countdown, after such a signal, was measured in minutes. Lamp took over the controls with lightning speed, but there was no panic in his voice. Just concentration. Only honed years of training and the habit of working even in chaos. Bahrain Control, UPS 6. We have a fire on board. Request immediate return. The captain pressed the microphone button almost automatically. The dispatcher, without wasting a second, suggested the nearest option. Doha, about 100 miles ahead on the left. Dubai is almost twice as far away, around 180 miles. But the captain had already made his decision. He didn't want to search for maps, request charts, or receive wind and approach data. In fire conditions, each new factor complicates the task. In Dubai, he knew everything in advance. Wind directions, lane locations, operating frequencies, departure patterns, and approach routes. He knew where to go in the fog, in the rain, in the black smoke box that would soon surround the cabin. He turned the plane 180 degrees, as if putting a bold dot. We're going back. Meanwhile, Bell has already opened a checklist for a fire on the cargo deck, a procedure that few people really want to repeat in reality. A structured set of steps that, in theory, should deprive the fire of oxygen and give the crew precious minutes to gain. The first step is to turn off Pack 2 and Pack 3. This did one thing. It lowered the pressure in the cargo hold. The second step is to open the pressure relief valve in the tail section. This creates controlled decompression, controlled depressurization of the cargo area. The goal was clear: to pump oxygen out of the deck so that the fire would suffocate. At the same time, the checklist specifically required to keep an altitude of about 25,000 feet, because at this altitude, the air already contains less oxygen. But back then, Bell and Lamp still didn't know one key detail. The fire they were trying to smother contained its own oxygen. Lithium batteries are a special category of fire. They don't wait for more air in the compartment. They produce their own. And when one cell enters thermal acceleration mode, neighboring batteries begin a chain reaction. The fire on the main deck did not look like a classic Gorenge. It resembled a chemical factory that accelerates itself and does not need an atmosphere. But the crew couldn't know the scale. The smoke detectors on the 747 respond only when the smoke concentration reaches a certain threshold. And the fire was already raging inside the container, going beyond the controlled time. Lamp, holding the descent, checked the controls, turned off the autopilot, pulled the steering wheel towards himself, then pushed forward. The plane reacted. He turned on the autopilot again. everything has worked so far. But this was only the first test, not yet reflecting the true picture below. And while the cabin was still relatively clean, the crucial error was already happening behind the instruments. Pack 1, the only remaining pack that was supposed to work to keep cabin pressure higher than in the cargo hold, shut down quietly. Because of the signal, because of the multiple alarms, because of the very fault that seemed like a minor defect. Seconds after the fire alarm, it stopped supplying air. The crew did not see this. The ECAS was filled with higher priority warnings. The smoke has not penetrated yet. In their heads, they had a checklist: descent, altitude control, an attempt to defeat the fire through thin air. But without Pack 1, the last barrier between the fire deck and the cabin ceased to exist. Now the fate of the crew depended on the last layer of protection, a thick, fire-resistant coating separating the cargo compartment from the cabin. It held. It still resisted. But the fire beneath him intensified every second, melting metal, buckling structures, disrupting wiring, and heating everything nearby. And now the first point of no return has arrived. As the plane turned almost on its way back to Dubai, Lamp suddenly smelled a pungent odor. Bell raised his head and saw in the light of the panels how a thin, barely discernible fog appeared in the ceiling part of the cabin, near the ventilation seams. It's not smoke yet, but it's no longer normal air. It's only been 4 minutes since the alarm went off. But during those 4 minutes, the fire on the deck intensified so much that it began to burn through the thermal insulation between the cargo and the cabin. And now the cabin began to suck in dark, toxic gases that invisibly filled the space. Bell increased the oxygen supply through the mask. Lamp, 2. A moment later, the situation went from alarming to critical. Smoke burst into the cabin. Not a weak stream, not a light mist. No, it was dense, heavy, black smoke that seemed to be falling from above. Everything that seemed like abstract warnings on the screen became reality. The panels started to lose readability. The white backlight lights turned into blurred spots. Hot air filled the nose of the plane, and the sounds of alarms, hot air, and trembling structures mixed into one stream. And it all happened quickly, as if someone had flipped a switch. They couldn't see the instruments anymore. They could no longer breathe without masks. They no longer knew how many minutes they had left. All that remained was to try to return the plane to the ground at all costs, before the fire reached the vital systems that still retained the appearance of control. And the fire was already there, very close. Smoke covered the cabin like a thick blanket. Not a light haze, not a gradual darkening, but a dense, oppressive mass that in seconds turned the space around the pilots into a cloudy, gray cocoon. The light of the instruments, steady and confident a moment ago, now barely penetrated through the layers of particles, becoming faded, diffused. Bell instinctively raised his hand closer to his eyes. His fingers were already dissolving into smoke a few centimeters away. He could only see the outlines, the silhouettes of the buttons, reflecting off the glass of the instruments. The air became hot, dry, and heavy, as if the cabin had been heated from the inside. Lamp tried to check the controls again. I turned off the autopilot, pulled the steering wheel, and at that moment, something happened that makes the pilot feel absolutely terrified. The plane stopped responding to pitch. The steering wheel was moving. The captain's hands worked as always. But the plane did not change its angle or direction. It wasn't just a rejection. It was silence instead of a response. It's like you're driving a car that has lost its steering wheel. but you keep turning it, and it doesn't do anything. Lamp tensed abruptly and repeated the movement. 0. He pushed the wheel forward. 0. Smoothly pulled back. 0. Not even a slight vibration, not even a hint of a change in angle. Nothing. He didn't shout, but said briefly, in a hoarse voice, because of the mask and smoke, "I have no pitch control. I don't have a pitch control." Bell froze. These words contained everything that should not be allowed in the air, especially on a cargo liner packed with tons of flammable cargo, especially in conditions of a rapidly developing fire. But there was one thing they didn't know about yet. The autopilot could still control the tail unit. The mechanics of the 747 are designed so that manual control is transmitted through cables, pulleys, and levers extending from the cockpit to the tail under the floor of the upper deck. And now these cables have been exposed to the heat. The metal was softening. The tension was gone. The system started to hang, not transferring effort to where it was needed. But the autopilot uses other actuators directly connected to the tail stabilizer, and while these actuators were not yet damaged, the aircraft maintained its trajectory. That is, the captain thought that he had lost control completely, whereas in fact, only he had lost it, but not the system. However, it is impossible to make a conclusion in thick, acrid smoke under deafening alarms. Meanwhile, the situation in the cockpit was deteriorating rapidly. The smoke was getting thicker, darker, and hotter by the second. Fumes of molten materials, toxic components, and combustion products from the cargo deck filled the air, turning the cabin into a mixture of blurred contours, hot air, and beeps that now sounded almost continuously. Gorenge Bell groped for the right knobs, switches, and autopilot keys on the panel, trying to navigate by familiar shapes. Each movement took twice as long as usual. Each action required an effort, not physical, but mental, to overcome the growing disorientation. At some point, Lamp realized that his mask was supplying less and less oxygen. He briefly hit the supply valve, checked the connection. The air was coming in jerks, and his breathing was becoming uneven. One of the worst-case scenarios was coming. A fire was damaging the captain's oxygen system. If he loses his serve, the score will go up by seconds. The smoke that had already covered the cabin was deadly toxic. "I have no oxygen." His voice sounded muffled, as if from afar. Bell couldn't help. I couldn't even reach the captain through the smoke. He could barely see his own hands. Lamp made a decision. He stood up, unbuckled his seatbelt, and began to make his way to the back of the cabin, where the emergency portable oxygen tanks were located. It was a desperate, but only step. He had to find the mask by touch, blindly, in a cramped cabin filled with smoke, in which he was almost by touch. But he left, and not a single word was said from him. All Bell could hear was the chaos of instruments, the muffled crackle of the radio, the incomplete phrases of the controllers lost in the intervals between the hiss of static and the noise of the plane, which continued to fly in the dark. Now UPS Flight 6 was piloted by one person. One person is against fire, smoke, system failures, lack of visibility, and loss of communication with the dispatcher. The smoke covered the cabin so tightly that Bell could no longer see the horizon, the ground, or his own feet. The only landmarks were the instruments, but even they blurred, turning into indistinct points of light in a dark, smoky box. The autopilot remained on, and this probably saved the plane from an immediate, uncontrolled trajectory. But the autopilot couldn't do everything. He didn't see the smoke. He didn't feel the heat that was destroying the wiring. He did not know that the fire was rising closer and closer to the systems responsible for controlling the stabilizer. Bell had to do one thing: get the plane on the landing path to Dubai. There was still a chance. The autopilot was still on course, until the fire destroyed it completely. He leaned forward, his face almost touching the dashboard, trying to make out the frequencies, switches, settings. It was necessary to turn on the ILS system, which would be able to guide the aircraft along the glide path, even if the pilot could not see anything. It was their last chance. And in the midst of the smoke, barely discerning the letters, he still managed to adjust the desired frequency. ILS 12L is the very runway from which they took off. Now she was going to be their only way down. But Dubai was still dozens of miles away, and the fire was growing beneath them, and the plane was turning into a hot, blinded container that was getting harder to control by the second. Bell was sitting in the cockpit, which now looked more like a smoke tunnel than an intercontinental airliner control center. Thick black smoke filled the entire space, so dense that even the indicator light was reflected not on the surface of the instruments, but on the smallest particles in the air. It didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it was getting darker, as if rising from somewhere below, with a force seeking complete dominance in the narrow cabin. The hot air burned, not with fire, but with a palpable breath of heat, as if from a huge furnace located directly behind a thin partition. Metal, plastic, electrics, everything that could heat up, heated up. On the floor, under the panels, there were cables that controlled the aircraft. Cables are the basis of manual pitch control, but the fire below deck has already damaged them, disrupted the tension, deformed the rollers. Bell did not see the captain. I didn't hear him. He was alone. Alone in the cabin, which was rapidly turning into an uninhabitable space. And yet, he continued to work. Clutching the steering wheel with his left hand, he groped for the autopilot buttons and radio navigation panels with his right. He had to not just return, but aim the plane precisely at the axis of the glide path, because visually he would not see the runway even under ideal conditions. The ILS 12L was their only chance. Automated landing is the last opportunity to reach the ground with zero visibility. But for that, he needed to know where he was at all. And here, a new problem struck him, vile in its simplicity. He could not contact Dubai. The radio station remained tuned to Bahrain's frequency. They switched there a few minutes before the fire and stayed that way. But now, as it descended and moved away from the center of coverage, UPS-6 simply moved out of the line of sight of the antennas. The radio panel was in front of Bell's eyes, but he couldn't see the frequency numbers. I couldn't figure out which one was displayed. He couldn't manually switch it to Dubai approach, the channel he needed. The smoke made the screen almost black. The letters and numbers became a blurred, green spot. He was in the sky, with a burning cargo under his feet, without a captain, without visual orientation, without normal pitch control, and now also without direct communication with the dispatchers of the airport, where he was desperately trying to return. But pilots have one option in such situations: to use another aircraft as a repeater. There's always someone ahead, above, or below. This time, it was Fly Dubai Flight 751, and Bell, almost by touch, pressing the button of the radio station, transmitted briefly, "Mayday, Mayday. We need vectors to Dubai. We have smoke in the cockpit. Fly Dubai has accepted the message. Fly Dubai transferred it to Bahrain. Bahrain contacted Dubai by phone. Dubai passed the instructions back to Bahrain. Bahrain, Fly Dubai. Fly Dubai, UPS 6. It was like playing a broken phone game, only the stakes were incomparably higher. Time was running out. The fire grew. The smoke became almost opaque, and delays could reach tens of seconds between dispatcher commands. But still, the information was coming. Gradually, it was hard, but it went on. UPS 6, heading 300, distance 35 miles to Dubai. Maintain. Fly Dubai transmitted, trying to pronounce each word clearly. Bell heard it, but the words were lost in the background of static and alarms. He leaned forward to hear better, and felt the warmth from the floor seep through even his boots. The temperature was rising. The fire was already very close. At that moment, the first thing that looked like a ray of hope happened. The autopilot began to catch the glide path. The system sensed a signal from the ILS, which means that the plane was already close enough to the airport. A glide path is an invisible line leading to the lane itself. If you enter it, you can reach the ground even without visibility. But the trouble was, the UPS 6 was going too high and too fast. Bell, realizing this, released the interceptors, the upper wing panels that act as air brakes. But due to damage to the cables, they only partially rose. The effect was weak. He lowered the flaps by 20 degrees, which increases drag and helps reduce speed. I tried to set it to 30, as in a normal approach, but the automation blocked it. The speed was too high, and the system was afraid of destruction. I released the landing gear and heard the beep of the gear display E. The landing gear did not come out, or they didn't come out completely, or the sensor didn't see their position, and in the smoke he couldn't check visually. But right now he didn't care. Landing with any degree of landing gear release is better than a fire in the air. The autopilot continued to guide the plane, but now the worst had begun. The plane had already crossed Dubai, several thousand feet above the runway, before it had time to descend. They flew over her. The chance was lost. Now it's just a backup option. Bahrain, via Fly Dubai, transmitted Sharjah, 10 miles left, heading 095. Sharjah was close, very close, and it could be achieved. But at that moment, in the endless smoke, navigating almost blindly, Bell made one mistake. Instead of heading 095 degree, he set 195 degree. The plane began to turn, but in the opposite direction. The autopilot kept banking, but the angle became dangerously large. The bank angle alarm went off. Bell tried to return the plane, but control was partially lost, and he could actually operate only through the autopilot. The systems started to fail. The smoke became almost opaque. The hot air became unbearable. The smell of Gorenge is strong, pungent, metallic. UPS Flight 6 was entering its final phase, a fatal, irreversible one, when the fire reached the key stabilizer control systems. Bell pulled the wheel with all his might, but the effect was minimal. The plane began to descend, going into an uncontrolled dive. There was only darkness in front of him. No land, no lights, no horizon. There was only thick smoke and the red glow of the instruments barely making its way through it. He fought to the end. And at an altitude of only about 1,000 feet, he was able to level the plane for a moment. For a moment. A short breath. But the speed was dropping. The loss of control was too great. The fire destroyed almost everything that kept the plane in the sky. A few seconds later, the liner tilted nose down again. And at 20:41, just 28 minutes after takeoff, UPS Flight 6 crashed into the ground. A huge, fiery blast rose into the black sky, and there was silence. Both pilots died instantly, but miraculously, the plane crashed away from the Silicon Oasis residential area, literally hundreds of meters from the houses. No one was injured on the ground. When the first emergency services reached the crash site, flames were still cutting through the darkness. Huge fragments of the metal body lay, as if scattered by a barbaric force, around the epicenter of the impact. Individual structural elements were still hot, and some showed traces of molten aluminum, the result of temperatures that are not reached in normal accidents. Lithium batteries scattered along the fault line continued to smolder even after the impact. Looking at what rescuers understood, the fire was not just strong, it was chemical, saturated with energy that traditional means could not extinguish. At first, no one knew the scale of the tragedy, but it quickly became clear that the crew had not survived. The fall was too sharp, the angle was too large, and the impact energy was enormous. It was the finale of a struggle that unfolded not for kilometers, but for seconds. However, it was after that moment, after the silence on Earth, that the work of those who had to reconstruct the events of that night began. It was they who brought to the surface all the small fragments of the chain that made up the disaster. A large-scale international investigation has begun. It was attended by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, Boeing, UPS, dangerous goods specialists, engineers working with lithium batteries, and representatives from several countries. We studied everything: the remains of the structure, burnt-out elements, FDR and CVR data, fire-spreading routes, cargo characteristics, and the chemical composition of the residues inside the containers. Gradually, a cruel but clear picture began to emerge. First and foremost, the fire started before the crew received a warning. This became apparent when the experts saw the degree of damage to the structural elements and skin of the cargo deck. The fire main deck FWD alarm went off at 2013. But from the visual data, the distribution of charred surfaces, and the degree of melting of materials, it became clear that the fire had been developing for several minutes, quietly, inside the container, hidden from smoke detectors. Secondly, lithium batteries have become the main fuel of the fire. A huge number of them, about 81,000 pieces, created a cascade reaction. Each battery, heating up, gave out energy and oxygen, which was instantly picked up by neighboring cells. Many reactions took place inside the container, raising the temperature to a level at which the aluminum floor panels and the interior of the cargo compartment melt. The fire didn't just spread, it accelerated. And no conventional aircraft system was designed for this type of fire. Third, the PAC-1 system really shut down at a critical moment. The report will say later, PAC-1 was the only element that was supposed to prevent smoke from entering the cabin, creating increased pressure. The loss of pressure caused the smoke to rise up and enter the cabin unhindered. And as soon as the fire-resistant insulation gave way, everything that was burning below rushed to the pilots. Fourth, the loss of the cable wiring and the mechanical connection of the pitch control was inevitable. The temperature from which the cables were deformed reached several hundred degrees. The metal couldn't stand it, and the force from the steering wheel stopped being transmitted to the tail. The paradox is that the autopilot was still holding the plane, not because the system was stronger, but because its electric drives were located at a different point in the structure and were damaged a little later. That is, the plane could still fly, but only with autopilot. Bell, in total darkness, couldn't have known that. He was acting blindly. Fifth, the captain's oxygen regeneration system was indeed damaged by fire. Pipelines running from the cylinder to the mask passed near the heating zone. When the heat became too much, the compound stopped supplying oxygen, and the captain was forced to get up, trying to get to the backup mask. After only a few breaths of toxic smoke, he lost consciousness. There were 2 seats in the cabin, one empty, one still working. And in second place was a man who was holding a 747 in his hands, flying in smoke and collapsing from the fire. But one of the most dramatic parts of the investigation was not related to technology, but to the assessment of the crew's actions. In a complete flight simulator equipped with the most accurate simulation possible, 3 experienced pilots attempted to replicate UPS-6 flight conditions, including smoke, control failure, loss of visibility, communications failures, and fire. The 3 of them worked together. Tasks were distributed between them. They didn't have hot smoke. They could talk to each other. They could see the instruments. They could switch and transfer control. But the result was the same. None of the 3 pilots could bring the plane to the runway. One of the experts said a phrase after the training session that has become almost a symbol of this case. What the first officer of UPS-6 did alone is almost unbelievable. He managed to bring the plane to capture the glide path without seeing the instruments, without a captain, without normal control, in a completely smoky cabin. Most crews wouldn't have gotten that far, even with 3 of them. Bell fought to the end. Absolutely, until the last second. With full awareness that control is going away, with complete lack of visibility, with hot air all around, and with silence where the captain's voice is usually heard. The investigation ended with recommendations that later changed freight transportation around the world. The introduction of early thermal fire detection systems, not just smoke detectors. Strengthening the fire resistance of containers in order to restrain the thermal acceleration of lithium batteries for at least a few minutes. Installation of active fire extinguishing systems on cargo decks, on all large cargo aircraft. Stricter regulations for the transportation of lithium batteries. These measures came too late for Lamp and Bell, but thanks to them, similar fires are now much less likely to lead to disasters. UPS Flight 6 has become an example of how dangerous the combination of modern chemical cargoes and the lack of specialized protection systems is. But at the same time, it is also an example of the incredible professionalism of the crew, who fought for their lives, for the plane, for the chance to reach the ground, despite the conditions that were almost insurmountable. The story of Flight 6 is not just a tragedy. This is a painful reminder to aviation. Even the most powerful and reliable machines cannot defeat fire, which creates its own oxygen. And that sometimes, in the darkest cockpits, pilots do incredible things. When the investigation was completed and the official documents were laid on the tables of regulators, the aviation world saw not only the technical picture of what was happening, but also what was hidden behind it. The strength with which the crews are fighting for the plane even when conditions become unbearable. On the ground, amid the rubble near Dubai, this fight looked over. But in the data from the recorders, in the charred parts of the floors, in the behavior of the instruments, in radio conversations, it is clear how long the UPS Flight 6 crew tried to maintain control. The fire was fast-moving. Chemical combustion, is merciless. Guerrilla systems are unprepared for this type of threat. But the people in the cockpit are resilient. 30 minutes. There was only so much time between the moment when the huge Boeing 747 gently lifted off the runway in the warm Dubai air, and the moment when it disappeared in a fiery splash among the deserted construction sites. But in those 30 minutes, everything fit in. Decisions that were made without a second's hesitation. Failures that destroyed each new layer of protection. A smoke cloud that covered the cabin like a thick wall. A struggle in which the pilot was left alone in unbearable darkness. And despite all this, UPS-6 continued to fly. Until the last one. Until the moment when the controls stopped obeying, and the fire finally took over the structure. After this tragedy, airlines and manufacturers have reviewed the methods of transporting lithium cargo. The containers have become stronger, detection systems are faster, the regulations for transportation are stricter, aircraft are safer. Each of these changes is the result of a loss. Each one is a lesson that aviation gets at too high a price. But that's how progress works. He is moving forward with steps that are paid for by those who can no longer tell what they have experienced. UPS Flight 6 is not mentioned as often today as passenger plane crashes. But among pilots, among dangerous goods specialists, and among engineers working with fire extinguishing systems, this is one of the key cases of recent decades. This flight was a turning point, and the memory of him is not loud headlines, not sensations, but a quiet respect for the work of the crew and a serious awareness of how dangerous those cargoes that we used to consider ordinary can be. If you look back at that night, when the two pilots were sitting in a brightly lit cockpit, preparing for a routine flight, it seems as if no one yet knew how treacherous her scenario would turn out to be. But even when everything started to go wrong, even when the night was filled with smoke, fire, and alarms, the UPS-6 crew did everything possible, and even more, in an air full of smoke clouds, in a cabin where you can't see your own hands, in minutes when every meter of height goes away faster than it is possible to make a decision. At the moments when something that cannot be extinguished flares up around, they held on. And this is exactly what remains in the memory of aviation. Let their journey end in darkness. Their experience has become a light that will make other flights safer.